Right, getting us started with our regions here, we're going to start with Europe. So just kind of looking globally here at what part of the world we are in. So we are going to be focusing on our European nations. So our learning objectives, identifying those key geographical features, explaining the impacts of the Industrial Revolution, and then looking a lot at population geography. So looking at migration and then controversies over that. So starting actually first with our climate in this region. So this area is actually not as cold as you might expect given the high latitude. So how close it is to the North Pole. So if we kind of compare it to where Canada is, that's where most of the European nations are going to fall. But it's not quite as cold as what we typically think of as Canada. So for example, if we look at Saskatoon, Canada, the average January temperatures there is negative 5 degrees Fahrenheit. However, Amsterdam, it's in the Netherlands, it's at the same latitude. So if we can compare here and then Saskatoon, they're at the same latitude. So they're the closest, same distance away from the North Pole, same distance away from the equator. However, even at the same latitude, in the Netherlands and Amsterdam, the temperature is much more mild, 33 degrees Fahrenheit. So again, both of them have the same latitude, but they have very different climates. And the reason for that is the proximity to water. So most of the European countries are close to all of the water that we see here. Whereas in the inner parts of Canada, they're of course much farther away from water. So that's what's actually going to cause the changes in the climate. Right, so the way that happens, so water has the ability to maintain a constant temperature. So even though the temperature may be increasing or decreasing, the water temperature stays about the same. And that's why if you've ever been to the beach, it's always cooler right at the water than it is as you go more inland, because all the water there in the ocean is holding in the higher temperature, so it's keeping it cooler because that water doesn't want to change its temperature. So areas that are more surrounded by all of this water are going to have a much more temperate or much more kind of consistent temperature. Then as we move more inland and away from the water, that's whenever we're going to get ranges where we have higher temperatures in the summer, lower in the winter, and those types of things. So you can see within Europe, we have lots of different kind of climates, but for the most part, they're all going to be pretty moderate or temperate. So we have a lot of this temperate Mediterranean climate. As we move closer to the North Pole, then we're going to start seeing those colder climates start to come in. The cooler continental climate or the subarctic climate, they're going to start to get a bit colder just due to the higher latitude, but for the most part, a very temperate climates. So what is or what countries actually make up Europe? There are multiple countries that make up Europe. Most of them you're probably very familiar with. So Norway, Sweden, and Finland. Of course, Russia is not part of Europe, but just showing its proximity here. We have a lot of very small countries that we like Macedonia that are down here, Albany or Albania. So again, some very, very small countries. Some of the larger ones like Spain, France, and Germany. Of course, the larger, the United Kingdoms. But again, multiple countries make up this region. If we look at our tectonic plates here, we can see several of these. So we have, excuse me, the Eurasian plate is the main one. So over here in Europe is where we're at. So if you remember from our introduction, the most geological activity, if we think about earthquakes and volcanoes and that, are at the plate boundaries. Well, Europe is not really all that close to a lot of boundaries. So they don't see a lot of geological activity like earthquakes and hurricanes and volcanoes. So we have the Eurasian plate here that borders along the African plate. But again, a lot of that kind of occurs more over water. So we're not going to see a lot of geological activity in this region because it's not close to a lot of plate boundaries. And again, a little video here that looks at those to help explain that as well. So some of the physical features in Europe that we see that are kind of highlighted here. So we have the Atlantic highlands, the North European plain. So the plains are going to be lower lands. The Ural Mountains we'll talk more about here. That's kind of a natural boundary that separates Europe from Russia. Of course, the Alps, we think about the elevation, but lots of mountains that are shown here is kind of the darker green. The Caucasus Mountains, again, another natural boundary that separates Europe from Asia or the Middle East. So again, we have some mountains, we have some plains. Again, some of those mountains are going to be natural boundaries. So again, the Ural Mountains, the Alps, the Pyrenees are kind of more common ones that we talk about. Again, as we mentioned with the climate, they're very close to the water, so lots of seas in the Atlantic Ocean, of course, right there. There are also many rivers that flow through this region, and again, that alters their climate. And then we also have the European plain, though, that's good for agriculture to help with the growing of those resources. Again, just a little bit more here about the Ural Mountains, just that, again, kind of natural physical border that separates Europe from Russia. So some of the history about this region. So early human settlers are all thought to have originated in Southwest Asia, but then again, thinking about Pangea and everything being connected at one point, the thought is that they moved through that Caucasus Mountains up into the European region. If we think about societal influence, so Greece had a huge impact on that as far as their culture and political influence. We think about the Roman Empire, that kind of enduring marks on that modern architecture is still seen in the European countries, just their governance, their language. So they were, for the most part, united under Christianity, so a similar religion. Now, after the Roman Empire, then we started to see tribal and ethnic allegiances. So modern European national and political boundaries are now different after World War II. So we'll talk about the impacts of that on the history. So our modern Europe, so it has benefited a lot from globalization. So again, trading, providing resources, but not all of those countries are equal as far as their economy. So again, talking about that inequality. So we can see some of the countries, the darker the green is, the greater, or the, the darker the green, the better their economy. So as we move more inland and closer to Russia, those countries start to have a little less economic influence or benefit from that. So Western Europe has benefited more than Eastern Europe. So again, that wealth has not been equally distributed. The Industrial Revolution started in Europe and had a huge impact on its economy. So this just refers to the changes in manufacturing. This was in the late 18th century to the early 19th century, mainly due to the invention of the steam engine. Is what started it. So this is where machines started to replace human labor. Again, if we think about that population geography, so as more industrial and more technology advances, then less children are being born to kind of support the family, so that population dynamic starts to change. But also this had huge changes to the society, to the economics and agriculture. So the agrarian, which is more dependent on farming and agriculture. But also we had this agrarian revolution to where we had better tools. So again, tractors and that type of thing then led to better agriculture or more productivity. So overall, just increasing total productivity in which better supports their economy. So this positive feedback then between that industrial and agrarian revolution. So again, less people working in the fields, but still able to produce more crops due to, again, tractors and other advances in technology or in machinery. So more people then moved to working in factories in that larger production. That again also means more food, which supported a larger population. So then the population though shifted from those rural areas to the more urban areas within that population. Industrial revolution and that huge spike in their economy that provided wealth allowed them to start exploring, and that led to colonialism. And we'll kind of see this as we move through all the different regions, because as you can see from this map, at one point or another, Europe was directly or indirectly influenced almost all of the world. So really the only place that they were not able to set up colonialism or kind of set up colonies or have influence in the different regions, the only ones kind of exempt from European colonialism was Russia, and in some parts of that, of more like the Middle East is what we think of here. But all the other regions have been influenced by the European colonialization. So we think about the British Empire that's shown here. It's the largest empire in history, more so than the Roman Empire. But again, it covered or had influence in almost all the parts of the world except for Russia and some parts of the Middle East. So the European core, again, we talked about Western Europe versus Eastern Europe. Again, Western Europe being more having a better economy, Eastern Europe lesser economy. So this is kind of the manufacturing centers that became part of or were then influenced by the Industrial Revolution. So that economic output is high. They're able to produce lots of goods and services, and those centers were close to the raw materials that were available here in more of these Western Europe countries, less so in the Eastern Europe, where we started to get more into the mountain areas of this region. Now, kind of focusing then to migration, this is kind of each region is going to kind of have a newer theme that relates to geography. So looking mainly at the population here and how migration has influenced Europe. So this is just talking about people moving from one place to another. And the idea is it's intended to be permanent, whether it is or not, doesn't matter. But again, whenever they're not just visiting, but they're intentionally moving is what we're referring to here as migration. So there's intra-region migration, so that's moving within Europe. So for example, moving from Germany to Italy, they're still within the European region, but just in a different part of it. And then there's inter-region, so this would be moving to Europe, so from Syria to Germany, so from one region to another. That would be inter-region migration. And there are different reasons for this. So we talk about these push and pull factors. So factors that push individuals to leave. So again, there are environmental, social, economic, and political. And then there are also the same kind of factors that pull and cause them to move into a region. So things that cause us to leave, a lack of jobs, so poverty. A lot of times we're seeing this more and more fear. So if there are wars and discrimination that are occurring, different disasters, we'll see whenever we get to Asia and we talk about tsunamis, unemployment, those are factors that cause people to leave an area. Pull factors would be the opposite. Again, a lot of people come to the United States because of those better opportunities, compared to war. Again, safer environments, more stability, more freedoms that come along with those. So those are pull factors. Now, thinking about the push factors, anti-Semitism had a huge influence on this region. So this is leading up to World War II, and the anti-Semitism is referring to how the Jews in that population and those who supported the Jewish communities or the Jews were treated. So this picture here just shows again that expulsion of the Jews. So as they pushed them out, and then where they relocated. So there was some region migration. So they were moving from one part to another, but for the most part, they were completely leaving and going to other regions. So the Jewish people had been forced to migrate extensively throughout Europe due to that anti-Semitism. It is a recurring theme that we see in this history that influences their population and just their history in general. So a lot of them migrated from Judea in the first century. That's why there were so many in Europe before World War II. And then they were accused of causing the Black Death Plague. That's kind of what started some of that anti-Semitism. So we think about COVID, and that was linked to kind of starting in China. So there was, some discrimination and to all Chinese, even whether they lived in China or not, but just kind of, again, those fears sadly just cause a lot of discrimination and a lot of assumptions back to that ethnocentrism that we talked about earlier. So they forced Jews to live in the ghettos, is kind of where that term actually started from, was that separation and isolation of them moving to different locations. And then, of course, World War II and Nazism actually killed about 6 out of the 9 million were actually killed during this time. Of course, that led up to World War II. But again, the impacts that whole anti-Semitism had was a huge part of the European history. So if we look, though, more recent migration, again, we come back to, unfortunately, more the Syrian war, where we're getting more and more people coming into Europe as they flee where they're living. So we have some interregional migration, so more moving from east to west. Again, as we talked about the economy, Western Europe has a better economy, so more people want to move to those to get jobs. So talking about the periphery to the core, just with more industrialization, more people moving to the urban areas, especially to the western region of Europe. Again, this has also been facilitated by that European Union. So we think about political influence as well. So countries who are part of this European Union, which is a collection of countries who aren't all under the same government, but they have, they can move, they don't have to use passports, they can easily move between these different countries. Just again, the ability to buy and sell in them increases that connection. And then we also have a lot of interregional migration, so a lot moving from North Africa and Southwest Asia into Europe. Again, better stability, less war, but also more advances or more opportunities for jobs. So again, mainly driven by the economic opportunities and escaping that turmoil. So again, if we look at this map, the majority of individuals coming into Europe are from Syria. This was kind of led to the 2015 migration crisis, where they had a lot of individuals coming into this area as they fled the impacts of the Syrian war. All right, so if we look at some of the national identities, again, a little video here that you can watch about this as well. But these European countries are not necessarily homogenous. So again, we talked about different regions. So it doesn't, just because they're in a region doesn't mean that they share a lot in common. So for example, there are a lot of different ethnicities throughout the different countries that make up Europe. Their religion can vary a good bit from each country. The languages, there are thousands of different languages that are spoken in Europe. So again, they don't, just because they're in the same region doesn't mean they all act or behave the same. So that sets up what's called a nation state. So this is a sovereign political area that does have some homogeneous ethnicity and cultural identity. So again, some of the countries that share that would make up a nation state. So for example, Poland is about 93% Polish, so they have a lot of homogeny within that country, whereas other countries, there may be multiple languages spoken in that same country. And then we have nationalism, and this is more of a feeling of political unity within a territory. So again, just having, so we think about like the American flag and nationalism as far as that goes. So again, this is more though a feeling of how connected they feel to their territory. So if we kind of look at some of these impacts on our national identities, so there's a broad shift away from organized religion towards secularism in Europe. This is modern Europe. So just a few terms here. So secularism refers to kind of the exclusion of religious ideologies from the government and just public activities. Again, nationalism, we just talked about, again, that feeling of national kind of pride. So there are trends towards secularism, and existing religions have magnified, though, a lot of the conflicts that are in these interregional migration. So again, those who are more religious can feel kind of ostracized by those who support more of a secularism, or vice versa. So that kind of influences where people live. So if they are religious, they kind of, are going to find regions that are more prone or have more religious individuals. So they, of course, kind of come together, and that causes some movement within these regions. So looking here at this kind of controversies that we see, so this is kind of showing the different views. Again, we said that a lot of individuals moving into Europe come from Syria and are moving away from areas that have a lot of political unrest or a lot of discrimination. So there are a lot more Muslims that are moving into Europe. So these kind of magnifiers that occur whenever we have people moving into a region. So again, that's secularism. So Muslims are very religious. So Europe, though, is more secular. So whenever you have kind of this collision of these different views, it leads to a lot of controversy and a lot of conflicts. So again, religious differences. So some of the trends that are seen. So again, we talked about early history in the Roman Empire. The majority of individuals in Europe were Christians. However, that's decreased from 75 to 65%, and maybe even more than that. And that's more than likely going to continue through 2050 and even beyond that. And then the Muslims, again, as they're kind of fleeing from the unrest and the wars that are occurring, so more Muslims are coming in, thought to increase from 6 to about 10% by 2050. So again, very different religious aspects, and then as well as the secularism, which is kind of not looking at either, so non-religious. So again, lots of conflicts that are starting to occur and expected to continue in this region. All right, and this is looking at how migration impacts those population dynamics. So whenever there's interregional migration, so again, individuals coming from Syria, where there's a lot of unrest, a lot of instability, into a more stable economy and region like Europe, they often have a higher birth rate. Again, they feel more safe, and they have more resources. So that leads to an increase in birth rate. So this is just kind of looking, so immigrant women, again, typically have a higher birth rate than immigrants. So again, even if they start to decrease over time, again, it's much higher for the immigrant women, about 2.6 compared to the native born or non-immigrants. So about an additional child per family. And again, that's just due to that more safety, but then that increases the population in that region that then can stress resources that are available. All right, so if we look at some of these or the different views about immigrants, so this is variable within different regions. And that, of course, then would determine where those who are migrating would go. So very few feel a moral obligation that it was seen in the past to be welcoming to immigrants. So for example, in World War II or after that, the Western European countries actually voted to not accept Jewish refugees, so they had to flee to different regions. They were not accepting of those who were being forced out or discriminated against. Also, currently, many European countries have opted to not accept those Syrian refugees who are fleeing from the civil war. So those who are, of course, more welcoming, that's where those individuals are more likely to go. But again, it's about, the median's kind of about 50-50, but again, it varies by different country or different region within Europe. So that can then influence where individuals are or are not able to go. Right, we also have this idea of deindustrialization, which is a shift away from heavy manufacturing and moving more to high-tech industries. So again, industrialization, steam engines, lots of factories, but now we're starting to see deindustrialization, which is now a shift to high-tech industry. So this coincides with the movement of highly educated workers to urban areas, not to work in a factory, but to work in those tech jobs. So immigrants often fill manufacturing or lower skilled jobs that are left behind in the rural areas. So as individuals move into more computer-based jobs or markets, then we still need to have food and we still need to have agriculture in those rural areas supported. So because there's a shift out of those areas, somebody still needs to do it. So that's where we start to see immigration of individuals filling those jobs. So this changes, though, the cultural landscape as we get immigration to those areas. So smaller rural towns often have the strongest anti-immigration sentiment because, again, those are where most of the immigration happens because that's where they can fill jobs and meet a kind of a workforce demand. But again, then those native to that region feel that they are being, possibly going to take their job. So again, not a lot of welcoming attitudes. And this is just kind of looking at the degree of urbanization and party position about the policies because this heavily influences the political power. So the proportion of votes that we can see. So the immigration policy score, those opposed, you can see between 2014 and 2019, there are many more opposed to immigration than support it. As we move from the rural areas more so than what is seen in the cities. So again, because most immigrants are moving into those rural areas to meet and to get jobs and to find employment, those are the ones most that are least welcoming to them. And then how that impacts the economy. So short term, it is a fiscal burden, and we're starting to, we of course have seen this in the United States as well. So as people flood into a region, there are more people to support. So short term, again, it definitely becomes a burden. However, long term, it's similar to the social benefits of the natives. So there's minimal net fiscal impacts. They can have a positive impact, so they can again help meet the demands. They can do jobs and have a successful integration So that integration can include welfare benefits, language training, professionalism, so education, public education for the migrant children, etc. So again, depending on how welcoming the region is to the immigrants. So the research suggests that more resources directed toward integration will have a larger economic benefit, so that if they can support the individuals coming in, then in the long term, those immigrants will have a positive impact on the economy. So that short-term investment will pay off in the long term is what the current research is suggesting. All right, so we kind of summarize the population dynamics. So it is shifting both demographically, so again, comparing men to women and religion and political, as well as culturally. So many countries are confronting different divides that are occurring based on that national identity, given the changes in the economy and the migration patterns. And immigration to Europe will likely continue, given its strong economy, people wanting to move into that, as well as fleeing unstable environments.